Hi, my name is Michael Smook. Today is July 23rd. It's a Monday, and we're in the year 2018. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today, it's a continuation of episode 26. It's entitled, Are We Safe Now? This is the last and final chapter. It's part 3. Today, in summary, what we'll be talking about is the first section is the rise of the surveillance state and the need to ensure our civil liberties, Fourth Amendment privacy protections. The next section will be suggested remedies, and we'll talk about, as a sneak peek, we'll speak about the need for to devote more resources towards resiliency, and then we'll summarize and say goodbye. So before we move on to part 3, let's briefly run through part 1 and 2, what we spoke about last week and the week before. 2 weeks ago, we spoke about part 1, and it's what happened on September 11th and how the United States was attacked not by a nation state, but by a terrorist organization. We discussed the damage caused, murder, and mayhem, what their plan was, their initial plan attacking the United States, and what I suspect is their long-term goal. We discussed their underlying philosophy, and we discussed how the United States since 9/11 has been, how do we say it? They've been going through 9/11 shock or atrocity trauma. And when you're going through this kind of stress, you make hasty decisions, which led us to part 2. Part 2 is called Miscalculations, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq sometimes I refer to as misadventures in the Middle East, because we were under stress and we didn't really think through these plans. But now that I've said that, I don't want to spend any more time criticizing President George W. Bush. I'm much more interested, well, let me back up for just a second. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and we had to live through the Vietnam War, and now, because of the surprise attack, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm thinking about, well, this is what Chapter 2 is about. What I'm thinking about is how in U.S. foreign policy we can have a methodical, systematic, dispassionate view of developing foreign policies in times of peace and in times of war. Think of that as one continuum to the other, and sometimes in between. How do we develop well thought out plans? And so that was what part 2 was about. And now that I've summarized part 1 and 2, let's move forward and talk about part 3. First, we're going to talk about the rise of the surveillance state and the need for privacy protections. On September 11th, all intelligence community agencies, at the time there were 16, now there are 17, they knew that Al-Qaeda was out there. They had committed terrorist attack on U.S. soil and overseas. And we knew that they were going to try again. We just couldn't connect the dots. That was the parlance of then, and that still applies now. We couldn't determine when, where, and how. So the terrorists attacked, and it was a terrible day. 3,000 people died, 6,000 were wounded, and the country, as stated before, was in shock over days, weeks, months, years. So I would like to say the intelligence community has grown considerably in the last 16, 17 years, but in terms of determining the number of new people have been hired, the dollar amount spent, the difference between 2001 and 2017 or 18, that's something that's not something I could easily find on the internet. It could be a classified matter. But there are other ways of determining the intelligence community's power in the past 16, 17 years. You simply need to look at the laws and technology. Since 9/11, there have been the U.S. Patriot Act, the FISA Act, and the USA Freedom Act. And in terms of technical abilities, the intelligence community, we have much more powerful supercomputers. The internet is used to a much greater degree by businesses, by individuals who rely a lot on social networks, emails, and text messages. So the internet is very powerful, and the intelligence communities use that to conduct spying, as well as close relationships with phone companies, foreign and domestic. In addition, we work closer with intelligence agencies from abroad. So overall, when you add it up, the intelligence community is far stronger than it was in 2001. Now, people really didn't think much about what the intelligence community did until 2013. That's when the Snowden scandal hit us. Ed Snowden was a 29-year-old computer analyst. He was hired by a consulting firm, which was in turn hired by one of the largest intelligence community agencies, the National Security Agency. Snowden was a very bright fellow and was given unusual access to highly classified information, and he decided that he didn't like what the government of the President, George W. Bush, was doing, as well as the intelligence community. He disagreed with what was going, and in an unauthorized fashion and illegally, he copied information and gave it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other press entities. And so Snowden, what Snowden was thinking at the time, and I'm not condoning his behavior, but what he was thinking was, well, I know what I did was unauthorized and illegal. But what the intelligence community is doing is they're conducting warrantless spying on an ongoing basis without getting a warrant, so the federal government is committing bigger crimes. I don't condone this behavior, but having watched enough of his videos on YouTube, I understand what his rationale was. Now, Ed Snowden now is given asylum in a country which is far more authoritarian than the United States, Russia. That's where he stays. And the thing about it, and he doesn't appear to be coming back because everything legally seems to be stacked against him. What do we do with Ed Snowden? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, after Snowden's pointed out that we were conducting mass surveillance without warrants, including in particular, something that really blew up, he pointed out that we were bugging phone calls for the Chancellor of West Germany and the President of Brazil. These are our allies, and we're bugging phones of our allies. So that was a big surprise. There was a lot of talk about transparency and that the American people deserve that because of our constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights, and there was talking about more transparency. After all, this is a democracy, and the President, Congress, the intelligence community, we pay their salaries. So there was talk about, well, the American people need to know more of what's going on. But things have changed since 2013. Now we have a Republican Congress and a Republican President, Donald J. Trump. And what's interesting is, let's just take one law, the FISA law, Foreign Surveillance Act, that was signed into law. It was going to sunset, so there was a rush to get it approved. And President Trump signed it into law. Some Democrats, it was mostly Republicans, but some Democrats supported it as well. And President Trump said this is the only way to protect the homeland. And the thing about this law is there are so many extenuating circumstances where the government can commit warrantless surveillance. And there are so many extenuating circumstances. And what makes it tricky is this is a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And the thing about it is the difference between foreign intelligence gathering and domestic intelligence gathering, the way the system is configured, anything that's posted on the internet in Europe or in Asia quickly comes over here. And phone calls, the way the system, the infrastructure is configured, phone calls come through the United States too, which gives intelligence agencies the ability to monitor anything and everything that's going on with these supercomputers. So the thing about it is, because the FISA reauthorization, and it was interestingly, it's called Reform Act, but there are so many extenuating circumstances where the intelligence agencies, there are 17 agencies in the community in the United States. They don't need to get a warrant if it's national security related. But the thing about it is, frequently they don't get a warrant. And the thing that is that, what if they're collecting information and it relates to, let's say, a nonviolent federal crime, and it might relate to tax evasion? It could have, it's something, and the federal government believes that you or I may or may not be guilty of a crime. Now, without a warrant gathering this information, if this information is handed over to a criminal justice organization at the federal, state, or local level, can this be used in a court? We don't know the answer to that. That remains to be seen. So the courts are going to have to work it out, or Congress is going to have to reform the reform legislation. So what gives me hope? The politics, policy, and programs of the current administration I lean away from, because I think that, of course, we need to keep our homeland safe, but at the same time, we need to ensure that our Fourth Amendment privacy rights are out there, are there for us. They're not diminished. Now it appears that they are diminished. And they need to be strengthened, because if we don't have Fourth Amendment and other civil liberties, what's the difference between the United States and another authoritarian country? And what gives me comfort throughout all this is that there are dissenting minority. One is a scholar. His name is Tim Edgar. He teaches a graduate program at Brown University. Out of law school, he got a job working for the American Civil Liberties Union. In between all that, he made a curious change. He worked for a number of years for George W. Bush, advising George Bush on mass surveillance and privacy protections. And then he stayed in the intelligence community advising Barack Obama. And Edgar has answered Q&As on the internet. He's written articles, and he said some interesting things. Edgar says it is possible to have software to work with the supercomputers, and at a certain point, a timeout can be called. The software will pop out a record, and senior administrators in the intelligence community will have to read this material. They'll give it to their counsel, and then they could run to a FISA court, and they could ask for a FISA court judge. This is a specialty court which is set up to rule on intelligence matters. And Edgar says this is something that could work. And he also suggests what we also need to do is we also need to have people who represent civil liberties. The ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, there are plenty of other organizations. So there need to be other lawyers in the room to conduct this as well. And so Edgar has some reasonable suggestions. And also, before I make a point, I want to mention that there is a bipartisan dissenting minority that in the Senate and also in the House, but I'm going to talk about the Senate for today. It gives me pause to feel a measure of calmness. I'm talking about Rand Paul. He's a Republican from Kentucky, a U.S. Senator, and Ron Wyden, he's a Democrat from Oregon. He's also a U.S. Senator. And these fellows endorse what Edgar is saying, and they're saying it is possible to continue with mass surveillance, call time out without jeopardizing our nation, and make it possible to assign warrants when it's necessary. So that's what gives me a measure of calmness about this whole thing. And the thing about it is, who do I want to trust? Do I want to trust the elected people in Washington who I'm leaning against, disagreeing, politics, policy, programs? Do I want to trust them? Or do I want to trust Snowden? Well, the thing about it is kind of interesting. We do have elections in 2018 and 20. And I have to believe at the end of the day that the system works, that democracy can fix itself. So the thing about it is, I find a measure of comfort also when I think about one of our founding fathers, James Madison. He wrote 230 years ago, before he became president, after the Constitutional Convention. Madison said, now that we have a constitution, or we're going to build a constitution, he said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. So Madison understood that, he understood human nature, but he also understood at the end of the day that through enlightened self-interest, that it was possible that at the time it was men, that men, or today, men and women, can make changes to fix things that need to be fixed in terms of the law, so we could have more equity, opportunity, justice. So it's James Madison that I look back and I find a measure of comfort in knowing that he's looking down on us and he's hoping that we work things out. So in terms of Ed Snowden, I'm going to throw him a lifeline. I would say this, if I was in a situation, I wouldn't have done what he did. But the thing about it is possible that there could be stronger whistleblower laws. Now, for federal employees. Now, Snowden was working for a contractor hired by the federal government, so maybe that whistleblower law hypothetically could include people who work for contractors. Maybe it's retroactive to 2013. That may or may not help Ed Snowden. Also, there are possibilities of presidential pardon, President Trump or a future president. So I'm not going anywhere near hero or traitor for Ed Snowden. I would have done what he did. And the fact is that at the end of the day, I have to believe in the 2018 and 20 elections, and I have to believe that the system works, and that's our last best hope. And that's where I stand on this section, which is the rise of the surveillance state and the need for privacy protection. To sum it all up before we move on, we have more work to do, and I'm looking to see stronger protections for our Fourth Amendment rights by the intelligence community and by Congress and the President. Either the current group we have now, or if there are new elections, by a group after 2018 and 2020. And that basically summarizes the first section of Part 3. Now, the second section, we're going to be quick about it, but we're going to make some good points. The thing about it is that how can the United States better prepare for the future, now and in the future? And if, God forbid, we have another 9/11. And there is a thinker, a scholar. She teaches at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Diplomacy and Law. Her name is Monica Duffy Toft. And Professor Toft thinks less about bullets and bombs, although there's nothing wrong when you want to protect our homeland, thinking about military, but she's focusing on the fact that the United States is at war in another way. We're involved in a cyber war. And she said we need to redouble our efforts to protect the homeland against cyber terrorism, possibly, and definitely it's ongoing cyber theft and cyber espionage. So in addition, what Professor Toft is talking about is the need to enhance food security, equitable economic growth, healthcare, the educational system, scholarships, and job opportunities, including like apprenticeships. And we need to rebuild the country through infrastructure rebuilding. And this is, I've been talking about this Google Plus essays and YouTube talks for 2.5 years. Professor Toft has been talking and writing about this for far longer. So I find a measure of comfort knowing that there is a thinker out there and who talks and talks about things that I agree with, and I align with her thinking, and she aligns with mine. We both, in a nutshell, what we do is we take the long view. And to me, what also ties into this, the election, what the last election told me, and it helps me in my thinking, is that the reason the presidential election went one way instead of the other is because there are a lot of middle-class people who don't feel so middle-class anymore, And I think that now here we are between Obama and Trump administrations. We've had 8.5 years of prosperity, but still low-income people. They're still low income. So the fact is that that's a national security issue. So if we could find a way to energize the economy and include low-income people along with middle-class people to give them opportunities, like the infrastructure rebuilding ideas that I've been talking about and other people as well, these are things that we need to do. And that's the lesson I got out of the last election. So before we close, let me just say that I agree 100% with Professor Toft that we need to allocate more resources toward resiliency, and we need to take a long view. And that about gets us near the end of this talk, so let's briefly summarize. What we spoke in part 3 today is we spoke about the need to, we spoke about the rise of the surveillance state, and we still have some work to do post 9/11 and post Snowden scandal. What we need to do is we need to work harder on revising reform acts and allowing for warrants to be issued on a regular basis and to protect your Fourth Amendment privacy rights and mine. So this is what I'm looking for. And I'm also looking for, in terms of a lot of policies, these are not just related to military or the intelligence community or homeland security with cyber issues, but it's also bread and butter issues about the economy. I believe that if the economy is going well and the middle class is stronger and low-income people feel that they have equity in the system, that we're going to be fine. And if, God forbid, something really bad happens, we're still going to be fine because we'll be resilient. So that about summarizes for today. This was Part 3, Suggested Remedies and Concluding Thoughts. And the overall subject matter has been Episode 26, Are We Safe Now? And so I hope I've answered that to your satisfaction over these 3 talks. And thank you for watching. So my name is Michael Smook. Today is July 23rd, and we're in the year 2018. And it's a Monday. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Until next time, goodbye and good luck.